Good afternoon. My name is Vincent Blok and I'm working at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. And this paper is about the phenomenon of hybridization and concerns materialism versus metabolism in our conception of the hybrid world. And I'm looking for a dualist concept of materialism as a limit of the post-human world in the technical era. So today there is an increasing trend towards hybridization in new technology development, and you can think about synthetic biology, engineered metabolic systems, which are sometimes called cell factories, but you can also think about hybrids between human intelligence and artificial intelligence, for instance. And this trend towards hybridization or hybrid technologies leaves no room for classical dichotomies between organic life and mechanic machines, or nature versus artifacts. And there are many people who nowadays are in favor of this trend. For instance, post-humanists who argue in favor of the blurring of all these classical dichotomies. So in a way, argue in favor of this hybridization. Haraway, for instance, talks about the symmetry of machines, human life, and the environment as the new world we live in today. And my intuition is that although I am inspired by the idea of post-humanism and the idea of hybridization, I also believe that we have to consider let's say, a symmetry and also an asymmetry to understand the human condition, but also maybe the condition of other life forms. And I explored reasons against this. I explored arguments against post-humanism in another paper, but you can maybe for clarity reasons, I can say that if we define human existence in terms of intentions, then we at least have to assume a difference between the one who is intending and that which is intended. Or if we say that life has to do with experience, then we need to assume a difference, a fundamental difference between the one who is experiencing and that which is experienced. So the question then is, if we take this trend towards hybridization in the post-human world serious, and we are looking for an asymmetry in this post-human world, where do we find the conceptual ground for such a dichotomy or asymmetry? And the usual suspect to think about this is the notion of metabolism. It is easy to understand that living beings are metabolic systems, while dead matter is not metabolic. So that is a possible candidate for this dichotomy. And at the same time, I'm not satisfied by this notion of metabolism, because it in a way assumes a fundamental dichotomy between living beings and dead matter, and it can in a way not take serious this new phenomenon of hybridization, which is at least to a certain extent a commonality between life and death, or living beings and dead matter, or artifacts and living beings. So that is why I explore also a second notion, which is responsive conativity, because responsive conativity is a concept that can be used for all material beings, and it's inspired by new materialism. And on the one hand, I think that responsive conativity can help us to conceptualize this hybrid post-human world. And at the same time, I also argue that it doesn't help us to find the dichotomy that we are looking for, the limits of the post-human world. So that is problematic, and that's why I, as a third additional step, then try to disconnect conativity and responsiveness as two separate trends or characteristics, ontological characteristics, that can provide such a limit to hybridization. And these are the three steps that I will explore in the remainder of this presentation. So the first thing to consider is metabolism as the difference between living beings and dead matter. Based on the wonderful work of Hans Jonas, who philosophically reflected on the notion of metabolism, we can argue that metabolism is the interiorization, the intake of food, energy, and information, an interiorization from the environment in the organism that constitutes this organism. So in a way, metabolism constitutes the self. It is self-assertive to the extent that the interiorization of food and energy constitutes the self. And at the same time, this interiorization is connected with an exteriorization of the environment. Because in order to engage in metabolic processes, we need to understand between the self and the other of the self. Food intake doesn't mean the intake of the self, but it involves the intake of the other, so to speak. And this is an interesting idea, maybe because you can say there are a particular range or a set or subset of beings in the world that can be seen as metabolic systems, living beings, while there are other entities, dead matter, which is not metabolic, like the stone or the sea or whatever, the table, the computer. So is metabolism useful as a limit to the symmetry of machine, human life, and the environment? So a limitation to the post-human world. Now, on the one hand, you can say that based on this notion of metabolism, we can say that hybrids, like a cyborg, is in fact not a hybrid. It is in fact a metabolic system. So it's a living being that is engineered, like in synthetic biology. Also, a living machine is not a hybrid. It's a bacteria, for instance, that is engineered. This is the argument that we have made in an article together with Julia Rijsenbeek. So on the one hand, it helps to understand a cyborg as a living being, and on the other hand, it helps then to oppose it to non-living material beings like the lithosphere, the hydrosphere, and the atmosphere that are not metabolic systems. So is this a fruitful distinction? I would say that although it is a fruitful understanding, it is not sufficient, because we are dealing with a new phenomenon of hybrids. And based on this distinction, we classify the hybrid as either part of the living or part of the dead matter. And we cannot take the phenomenon of hybridization itself serious. It presupposes, so to speak, a distinction instead of doing a phenomenology of the hybrid itself that posed this question. So that is the reason why I'm not convinced by this candidate, as so to speak. And that brings me to another potential candidate, which is the conativity of material beings. And this idea of conativity stems from Spinoza and is taken up by new materialists like Jane Bennett, but also people like Deleuze. And the idea is that not living beings, but all material entities are conative. They strive to persevere in their own being. So that holds for you and me, but also for the computer that is sticking together as one being, the table, the painting at the wall, etc. And the advantage of this idea is that it starts with the commonality rather than the difference between living beings and dead matter, and concentrates on this commonality that can also help us to understand this hybrid world. You can even say that if we in the previous slide introduced metabolism as way of self-assertion, you can argue that metabolism is just a special case of the strive of material entities to persevere in their own being. So self-assertion is not limited to metabolic systems, but self-assertion is a characteristic of all conative bodies, all material entities, and the metabolic self-assertion is just a special case of this conativity of material entities. So conativity is then the commonality between living beings and dead matter. That means that plants and animals, cell factories and cyborgs all are conative. On the one hand, this is an advantage, I would argue, because we take this notion of hybridity serious to understand and look at the commonality. At the same time, we are looking for a difference, and this difference is then not found in conativity because that is the commonality already. So we have to dive a little bit deeper in this whole understanding of conativity and to look at another aspect that is introduced by Spinoza already, because Spinoza argues that material entities are not only conative but also responsive. Now, to make sense of this idea, your body contains cells, and these cells are on the one hand a self, and they are separated from the environment, and at the same time they are responsive to the environment, the ecosystem that constitutes an organ. And also my organs, on the one hand, the organ in my body, as an organism, is on the one hand a self, a conative self, and at the same time this organ is integrated in an organism, and the organism, me as an organism, is on the one hand a self, and on the other hand integrated in a larger environment, for instance together with you in this room, or with the computer, with the world at large. And the idea of that is the way new materialists took inspiration from Spinoza's idea of conativity and responsivity, is that all material entities are on the one hand conative, self-asserting, and at the same time integrated in a larger whole, responsive to each other, co-constitutive, and we can take this as in terms of an ecosystem, but we can also extend this to the post-human world in which we live, namely the geosphere, the biosphere, and the noosphere that are constituting this post-human world in which all entities, not living beings, not dead matter, but also the computer, also you and me, also the telephone and my coffee in front of me, are interconnected and interdependent and co-constitutive for each other. I have explored this idea also in another paper on biomimicry and the materiality of technology. And I'm also inspired by this idea because it explains a lot of how human and non-human life live and be in the world, so to speak. And at the same time, because that's the starting point of my whole presentation today, I don't believe that this is sufficient. So on the one hand, it is this responsive conativity enables us to understand, theoretically speaking, what we mean with the post-human world. And on the other hand, it doesn't provide the dichotomy that I was looking for. And to make the dichotomy that I'm looking for concrete, one could argue, is it really the case that all material entities are responsive and conative? If we talk about you and about me, we can say that we are conative and responsive towards each other, and that we are interconnected in the actor network, in the world, whatever frame we use. But while a flower is responsive to the sun, it's heliocentric, or heliotropic, like us, it's not the other way around. It's not the case that the sun is responsive to the flower. We can argue that the evolution of a hybrid, like a cyborg or a cell factory in synthetic biology, is responsive to all kinds of conditions around it. But at the same time, it's not the other way around, to the extent that the material conditions of the geosphere are not responsive to these designs. So maybe this gives us reason to say we have maybe to distinguish between two types of being. Namely, we have conative bodies. All material entities are conative, but not all conative bodies are also responsive. In this regard, we disagree with new materialist positions then. We can say there is a particular subset of material entities that are conative and responsive. And let's say that these conative responsive entities constitute the ecosystems of the biosphere and of the noosphere. But at the same time, and in this noosphere or in this biosphere, agents are actants that are responsive to each other and constitute the post-human world. But this whole world, post-human world, is still dependent and embedded in the earth as conative body, which is not necessarily responsive. So this brings me to the proposition that we have to move beyond metabolism, and we have to move beyond new materialism, and to introduce a disconnection between conativity and responsivity of material entities as a potential candidate for this dichotomy between, on the one hand, the symmetric relation we have in the post-human world and the need for an asymmetry or dichotomy. The advantage of this idea is that, on the one hand, the idea of the responsive conativity of hybrid enables us to acknowledge the symmetry of the machine, human life, and the environment in the post-human world. And I'm not opposed to this idea that there is a post-human world, because this is true, so to speak. But at the same time, the disconnection between responsivity and conativity enables us to acknowledge also that the geosphere consists of conative bodies that are not responsive, but is rather autarkic. We can even say that the conativity of the Earth is, of this geosphere, is prerequisite for the emergence of the responsive conativity of the hybrid world of post-humanism. And with this, I come to a conclusion. I would like to thank my team with whom I collaborate on various of these projects, and I thank you very much for your attention.